Okay, so a lot of the changes in the architecture of the timeline enable us to have multiple views that were before only available in the timeline or in the batch views. So if we kind of look at our standard player here, we've got our triptych viewer, which we always had. Now, these are now accessible in timeline effects modules, so if we put an action onto this particular clip and we go into the action editor, you'll be able to see that we actually can maintain the triptych view inside of here. Very nice. The other thing as well is that most of the timeline modules now are also 1, 2, 3 and 4 viewport compatible layout, just as you would have had inside of batch. While we're actually in this effect, another thing to draw your attention is that we included some more options on how you view ranges inside of the timeline effects modules. So down the options drop down, we can view it as a segment range, we can view the actual media range, so we can see the extended heads and tails, or we can actually see the range which this particular segment occupies in the timeline whilst we're in a timeline effects editor. Transition presets also benefit from some updates because of the architectural change. We select the transition here, go to our wipes and dissolves. You can see that we now have things like action presets. So we're going to choose something like a left, right, conceal. Come through, play that back. You can see we get a nice white conceal there as well. While we're looking at that as well, with the change in the pipeline to 16-bit floating point, this also gives us access to things like Matchbox and the timelines and effects, but also Matchbox transitions. So if we come into Matchbox transitions, we're going to exit that straight away. That will give us access to the presets. And once again, we can load these up, and all these will be GPU accelerated as well. So if we do like a dots reveal, this is going to look really nice. We play that through. There we go. You can see that we can have nice GPU accelerated Matchbox transitions within the timeline. While we're talking about changes to the actual processing of the timeline, if we have a quick look at our actual effects menu, with the change to the rendering engine being unified with what we're using inside of batch, which is Flame Reactor 2.0, this also unleashes pretty much any of the batch effects we choose to expose onto the timeline. So here we've picked out the ones that make the most sense for doing sort of general day-to-day timeline compositing. But you're going to notice some additions of things like action was a timeline effect that came in, G-mask, G-mask tracer, color management, etc. So this is also a benefit of having a unified render engine between batch and the timeline environment. The Clunk Load is something else that came in as a benefit of the change of the architecture to the timeline. So before, if you want to do transparency or blending effects onto a segment, you had to load up an axis effect. Now what happened in this sort of single pipeline approach that we have here in the timeline, at the end of each segment's processing tree, if you like, is a Clunk Load, which can be either on or off. It's off by default. If you switch the Clunk Load on, then you have access to things like transparency changes and also blending, as well as things like pre-multiplication. Now, another thing that the Clunk Load does is it looks for any kind of matte or masking that exists in the pipeline up to that point. So here we've got a G-mask tracer. If we kind of turn that on, you can see that the Clunk Load will now take into account any kind of matte or mask that has been applied upstream from the Clunk Load. And then you also have all the usual things inside of there where you can go through into the Clunk Load. You can change the pre-multiplication, the blend, invert the matte, etc., etc., or turn it off. So once again, this also keeps it in parity with the Clunk Load that exists inside of batch and batch effects as well. In fact, it's the same module as we said before, just exposed at a timeline level. So staying on the subject of compositing in the timeline, sometimes you like to have the Clunk Load automatically kind of switch on. So what we mean by that is if we load up an action effect onto here and we go into the action module and we just drag out a little G-mask ellipse and just draw a mask around there, you can see that what's happening initially is that we are just cutting out against black. And then when we come out of the action module, if we turn on the comp, it will then composite that with the background. Now, 9 times out of 10, you probably want the action to composite with the layer underneath. So if we remove all that, we go into our preferences. In the timeline effects, batch effects, there's a nice little preference, use action background. I'm going to turn that on, and we're going to repeat that process again. I'm going to add an action, go into my action, add a G-mask ellipse for a second, and just kind of just draw that out and kind of invert that. And you can see now what it's actually doing is it's using the background as a source to composite on through the action timeline effect, even though composite or the Clunk Load is not actually turned on. So that's a useful one to know. timeline effects, batch effects, timeline action, use background will automatically enable you to use the layer underneath rather than keep turning on the comp node. Another little cheeky timeline effect is when you're working with gaps. So gaps, you can apply things like timeline effects, but also in the gap menu now you've got the opportunity to change that gap into an actual coloured source. So once again, you can choose whatever colours you kind of want. We're going to pick a blue here and replace that through. And then using a combination of that with the comp node, you can do things like washes and transparency and other bits and pieces like that, which is quite nice. If we turn that up to make it a solid colour again and just kind of select our gap, you've also got the opportunity to add a matte to that as well. So you could go up, we could pick another piece of footage. So we're going to pick this parrot for argument's sake, and we're going to use that as a matte to cut through inside of here as well. So lots of things that you can do with coloured sources now as a gap effect on the timeline. Even more useful things in the timeline is the addition of the LUT, or the new colour management node, that we can apply to either a segment or a gap inside the timeline. So if we put the colour management node here onto a gap, a couple of things. We're going to be looking at the enhancements to the actual quick menus in here. But in the colour management, we've got all the options for the new colour management, the connected colour, which are the top 4 here. Plus all the legacy stuff underneath with PhotoMap and 3D LUT, etc. But on the default, we can then quickly go through, we can browse for LUTs and transforms if we wanted to. And if we go into 3D LUT, that's automatically going to take us to our directory for our 3D transforms, which are the luster color 3D LUTs. Now sometimes these are really useful because we can actually add a slightly filmic look or a particular LUT that you may create. So if we choose one of the ISO ones, we're going to look at some Fuji stocks. We're going to choose this one for a particular moment, and you can see now if we toggle that on and off, we've now got this sort of very filmic LUT look on top of all this. Now what's good is that once again we can use a combination of the comp node to either blend or percentage this back as we choose, and because this is a gap, it's going to be going across everything that's in our scene. So it's a nice way of quickly applying looks to either a whole timeline or to segments. Let's turn our comp node off for a second, and actually if we go a little bit more into the color management node as well, there's been some enhancements as well. So presets now contain all your standard sort of like transforms to work in a scene linear environment, from log, from video, backwards and forwards. So this is nice quick access down here. And of course, once again, if we actually go into the editor mode for this, then we get the full blown module that we can then kind of use. So we'll look at the connected color stuff a little bit later on a separate section. But if you're familiar with the LUT editor from before, then you're going to see all your usual favorites that you would expect here. Your traditional lin to log, log to lin, and your gamma displays where you can go through and start making different adjustments. Don't forget also that when you've played around and making an adjustment, because this is quite a creative as well as a technical tool, you could go then and create that lookup table and export it and reuse it in other timelines and sequences. So that's the addition of the color management node into the timeline. So over the course of releases, a lot of work has been done on the timeline, especially to facilitate easier manipulation of multiple clips at once, so multi-trim and things like that. The way this works is that if we select a region of shots that we'd like to trim simultaneously, we're going to go into a trim mode, and if we control click on the head or the tail of another clip, and when we start trimming that, we will in fact multi-trim all those other clips at once. And we control click on the head of that, you can see that it does the same there. This works in ripple and obviously non-ripple mode. So if we come here and we start to trim the head of this, obviously all the heads trim, but we're going to be rippling that throughout the timeline. Also, don't forget that we can also do things like multiple slips as well. So once again, select a range that you want to work with, being the slip tool in ripple, and once again we can go through and we can slip. Ripple's not going to make a lot of difference in this particular case, but if we certainly did something like slide, and we have multiple shots selected, then we'd be basically trimming the tail of this particular shot, and the rest of the timeline will be rippling accordingly. So once again, multi-trim, a nice enhancement into the timeline. Match options also got a lot of refinement and a lot of love over the releases as well. So what we're going to look at here are 4 clips. We've got a clip here. Let's go to our full player. We've got another clip there. We've got a clip with an effect on it, and we've got a clip or a segment that has a B effects on it with multiple sources inside. Now the match options now enable us to match out all of these segments in various ways. So if we just go and have a quick look at the match options in the drop down, you can see that by default use sequence info is switched on. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn that off immediately. So everything is deselected. You obviously got the option to match everything out in a timeline, but we're going to see with everything switched off what actually happens when we do a match. What you've got to remember on this is I've actually got all the sources in a reel or somewhere in the workspace in this particular project. So if I do a match for this, what will happen is it will go back and look for wherever that source exists in the workspace, highlight it, it's going to show me the sources reel, and if I actually highlight that particular clip, if I actually go to the source tab for this, you can see that we just actually referenced or matched out the original source, everything's unrolled, no ins and outs. Alright. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go and hide that sources reel, and we're going to turn back on the default on the match, which is use sequence info. And use sequence info will actually take this particular source and match it out as it exists in the timeline onto the desktop. So we're going to do match out again. We're going to pick a location for it to go. If we look at the source of this now, you can see that what's happened is that we've matched the source out again, but now we've used the information in the sequence, in this particular case the ins and out points, as a reference into that matched out source. Another thing that sequence info will also do is if we make any kind of change to this clip, so if we actually rename it, and we're going to call it Bob again, Bob, rename that clip, and we go through and now match that back out here, our new source will be matched out with ins and outs as before, but obviously with the new name that we've given it. The other options that we've got, if we go to this clip for a second and we turn on match preserve handles and we match this clip out now to the desktop, is we get something slightly different. If we come and look at the view for the source again, we've got the clip matched out from the timeline, but in this particular case the heads are rolled in. So this is actually the segment length that exists in the timeline sequence. The heads and tails are still available, but they're rolled into the clip. This particular shot, as you can see, we've got an effect on. So we also have the opportunity then, if we come down to here and we change our match options to include timeline effects, is that when we do a, let's get rid of this, when we do a match now of this particular clip, it will match out that particular source with the timeline effect included as well. Finally, if we come to this clip, which was our batch effect option, and we go down to the match options, we're going to turn off include timeline effects, but we will include nested content. Remember we had 4 clips inside of this. When we now do a match out to a reel, what's going to happen is that we're going to have all those clips. Bring that back to the head frame on each one. So effectively we're matching out not only the BFX in this particular case, so this is the segment with the BFX on, but we're also matching out all the individual sources that are contained within that BFX, basically the nested content. So with all these options now, it's a lot easier to match out in exactly the way you want any content and media from the timeline onto the desktop, or in fact find where that original source lives within the project workspace. There are 2 new options in the timeline now to rename your shots, and both of them are using tokens. So if we come into a particular segment and we do the drop down, you can see that we've got rename and rename shot, and with comment wedged in between. There's also some hotkeys as well. You can actually just hit N over a clip now and it will bring up the rename dialog box as it would do on a clip in the reels. So you can see here what we can do is we can completely obliterate that name. In this particular case we're going to call it Dave and rename that shot, and that shot is now renamed as Dave. But other options that you also have inside of both rename and rename shot is to tokenize this as well. So there's a bunch of preset tokens that you can use if you want to know a particular track name or record frame or track or source name or source version ID. These are all things that we can have attached as a token to this, and you're going to see tokens throughout the application pretty much from now on. The other option that we actually do have as well is that we have the option to rename the shot, and the dialog box looks very similar to this. So once again, if we call this something like fx underscore and we start tokenizing this, we can actually start adding tokens inside of here as a dynamic entity. So if we took something like the background index, it's going to look at the position of the segment in the timeline and rename it fx. This is the variable, it's shot 24 as it exists in the timeline, underscore comp. Now what this will do when we actually commit this is that it keeps all the original clip name and tape name, etc., but it adds this metadata in brackets, in parentheses afterwards. So this is kind of like user definable metadata. What's also good about this is that if we came through and we actually selected the entire timeline, get rid of audio for a second, and we right clicked on any of these clips and went to rename shot and did exactly the same thing again. So it's going to be FX. We're going to do background index for this one, underscore comp. We can now actually go through and bulk rename based on these tokens the whole timeline. So you can see here that it goes through systematically, and this is shot 23, shot 24, shot 25, etc., etc. Using the background index token, which is quite interesting, is that it will then make an association with anything that exists above the particular shot. So you can see here that this is FX shot 24 on this particular track as a background, but the layer above it, which is effectively our green screen parrot that we want to comp, although it keeps its original clip name and tape name, it also labels this the same as the shot underneath. So it says there's a relationship between this particular segment on a track to the segment below. And this, as we will see a bit later on, comes in very handy when we start wanting to generate automatically batch groups on the desktop. We can actually use this to our advantage, this naming convention. So two options you've got your rename and you've got your rename shot. Both of these are containing this whole tokenized system that you can use to make things quite easy and to bulk rename in the timeline. So here we're going to kind of quickly look at the connected functionality that we introduced over several releases. The connected and the source connection, which is fairly new as well. We're putting this in timeline improvements because it does sort of feature in the timeline, although we start the process off in the conform module. So we're going to be loading up a couple of EDLs. One of the new things that came in was the multi-assemble, automatic detection. So essentially looking at the names of EDLs and automatically grouping them based on that naming convention instead of doing a layer per EDL. So we've got a 45 and a 60 we're going to bring in at the same time. What happens here is that it conforms these empty constructs directly into that new entity on the desktop we call the sequence rail. This is the mechanism that makes the connected conform and source connections work. So we could go back and we could look for the media for both of these, but we've got this button here that allows us to do a couple of things. What we're going to do here is we're actually going to create a sources sequence. The sources sequence will look at everything that's open in that sequence rail, and it will basically make a longest pull list of all the media it needs to bring in to conform those other sequences. Working the sources sequence, what we'll do is going to set a location for it to look for all those sources. So it's going to be kind of down in here. And then as you would do with a normal conform, you're going to find the criteria to match all of the media into those segments. So in our drop down here, we're going to do something like clip name source timecode. We get a whole bunch of matches. We're going to link those sources in. We're left with these. We're going to turn these two off for a second. We're going to get a match for those as well. We're going to link them in. So what we've done is we've conformed all of our media into our sources sequence. Now by doing that, we've automatically then populated all the other open conforms in that sequence rail. So they're all coming from that same sources that we're pulling into the sources sequence. And you can actually just leave it there. However, we do have then another option to create a new construct based upon these two open sequences and create a connection between those segments. So once we've done the actual conform, got the media in, if we then create a shot sequence, and once again we can filter out particular layers. In this particular case I'm going to be lazy and just delete the audio quickly. What we've done now is we've created a new sort of hybrid timeline, and it doesn't really make much sense in any kind of editorial format, but it's basically an amalgamation of the 60 and the 45 second timelines together. If we kind of zoom into this, you're going to see that there's these little chain links between the segments, which means that this shot sequence is linked to all the references of those segments in the other timelines. So at this point we can actually come back to our timeline view, because all of these are existing in our sequence reel, and look at some of the functionality that we get inside of here as well and what the actual connection means. So first off, when we have a connection, we have some new menu items in the contextual menu, and it will show me where this particular segment lives in other timelines, and clicking on that will take me to the 45 second. And then once again, if we do this again, it will take me to the exact place where that lives in the 60 second. So the whole idea about this is that we work on one sequence, in this particular case that hybrid timeline, the shot sequence, and then we can propagate that work automatically to all the other connected segments in our sequence reel. So if we kind of have a look at this, we're going to do something really easy. We're going to kind of come in and add an action. Go into the action editor for a second, and we're just going to draw a quick garbage mask around our big cat thing here. I'm going to come back out to this, and you can see that in my shot sequence I now have this very sort of like rough composite. Now what I like to do is I like to propagate that out to my 60 and my 45 second versions. If we kind of have a quick look at the 45 second version at the moment, you can see that at the moment we do not have that mask present. So the idea is that we can then take whatever timeline effect that we've applied and we can sync it to the connected segments. And once we've done that, if we then go and have a look at the 45 and the 60 second version, there's different timings on this, but basically our effects, our timeline effects, have then been propagated through to those other segment connections in those other sequences in the timeline. So the idea is that we do all our work once on a shot sequence, and then we can very efficiently push all of those effects to the other connected segments in the sequence reel. So we looked at shot sequences where we brought in all our conforms in one go and created a connection between all the segments. We're going to look at now sources connection, which takes a slightly different approach. We can start working on one conform, and then we can start adding recuts and conforms to it after the event without having to create a shot sequence. We're going to do that via sources connections. So to start off with, we're going to do exactly the same as we had before. We're going to go and get our 60 second master in. Now we're not going to create a sources sequence for this, but we are going to do a couple of things in here. We're going to save all the sources to a new sources reel on the desktop, and we're going to set a search location for this, which of course is going to be my DPX sources again. I'm going to set that. It's going to scan through, look at all the media, and then we're going to match it up according to the match criteria that we need to accomplish this. So let's go and choose this and this. Like we had before, we're going to link those sources down. And then we're just going to go and match up our audio and do this. So what we've got now is all of our sources are matched in to the 60 second version. We go to the timeline. And as you can see, we've got our 60 second version here, plus all of the sources for that sequence that have been saved out separately because we had save sources selected on our conform. So to make our sources connection workflow work, what we're going to do is we're going to go through, before we start working on this, we're going to select all of our layers that we want to have a source connection. We're going to right click on this, and we are going to create a source segment connection. And this is going to create that relationship between the segments that are in our 60 second version and our sources reel down here. And you can see that all the clips have been highlighted with that chain link. So just to keep it consistent to what we had before, we're going to go through and just put that same sort of effect on this particular shot. Remember, it's our two-layer composite. And we're going to select this, and we're going to put an action on as we did before. Just come into here, add a quick ellipse G mask just to cut through to the layer below. I'm just going to quickly invert that. And just to make it slightly different, we'll also add something like a color warper as well. We're going to come in here and we're just going to make it just slightly more warmer like that. So now we've got a noticeable effect on this particular shot. Now at this stage, what's nice is that we can come in and add a recut, or in this particular case a different version, and push all the effects that we've done on this version to that. Now the method is slightly different from the connected shot sequence which we looked at. What we need to do is go back to the conform module. We're going to go and find our 45 second version, which is here. This is a different one we want to work with, and we're going to turn off save sources, but as you're going to point the conform module to look at the sources reel that was created when we did our original conform here. So once again, based on our match criteria on this, we're going to get some matches. We're going to go and link those sources through. We've got a couple other ones here that's going to be linked, And then we're going to just go through and link up our audio. And now we have everything kind of working. Now, going back to our timeline, you can see that we've got our 60 second, now we've got our 45 second. But because we've pointed the 45 second at the linked sources, they will share this sources connection. So what's good is that if we go to our 60 second version now, and that shot that we kind of worked on, we can see that this is used in the 60 and the 45 that we just brought in, but we can also now sync the connected segments to the 45 second version as well. And once again, like the shot sequence, this is going to respect all the timing offsets and everything that we created, but we're working purely now on a sources mechanism where we can add edits in, as opposed to the shot sequence where we would have all the edits to start with. So this is really nice. It's two different ways of working depending on how your conformers are supplied to you, but it gives you the flexibility to be quite reactive either way depending on how the work is appearing into frame. So that's shot sequences and sources connection. The one last thing that's quite nice is that we can create our own manual connected segments and paste them across timelines without even having to do any of this at all. In this particular case, we've got our edits, and towards the end there is like a consistent pack shot. So maybe this has some text or something over it, which we would like to propagate over all of our versions. Now we don't have to create a shot sequence or a sources connection in this particular case. Actually what we can do is we can create our own manually connected segment and paste that to other timelines. So if we come in here, we're going to create a BFX on this particular one, and we're going to put some text on it. This could obviously be some animation or actually be quite a nice graphic. We're just going to put a text module in and put some text on this. So if we make it sort of fairly large, and we just call this pack shot. There you go, that's nice and obvious. Now we come out of here, this is on our BFX, we exit the BFX, and of course this is now on my 60-second version. Now if we right click on this particular segment, we can then create a segment connection which will put that chain link in. And that means that when we copy and paste this to any other sequence, it will retain this connection to the original timeline it was created on. So let's go to our 45. And we're going to scoot down to the end where the pack shot is, and we're going to set our positioner to be in here, and we're going to go through and we're going to go and paste that connected segment. So if we kind of scrub back on this, you can see that that has got that pack shot text on as well. What this means now, if we go back to either one of these and we make a modification, so we're going to come into this, we're going to go to our BFX, I'm going to go to text editor, and we're going to come in here, we're going to space, and we're going to say good, and return out of this, and then back to the timeline. And when you right click on this, we can sync the connected segments. And if we look at our desktop and our 45 second now, look at this, that change is now rippled through to the 45 second as well. So even if you don't want to create a source connection or a shot sequence connection, you can actually create your own manually synced segments for purposes just like this. New surface options in action include the new perspective option. So if we look at bilinear first and see what that does, if we set up a bilinear, so if you're doing some corner pinning or something like that, or spring placement, you can see that what happens with bilinear is that you get quite a distortion. We can toggle that live to perspective, and you can see in perspective mode it's actually starting to obey proper perspective based on the corner points rather than a distortion that you would normally get with bilinear. Other useful attributes of the perspective surface is that if we line something up roughly in perspective on here, we want to start kind of doing some tracking. So normally with a bilinear you're going to get 4 corner points that if you move you're going to adjust the shape of this. When we go into the vertices on here, in the perspective you still get 4 corners and position, rotation and scan, etc., but you also get a default of perspective tracking. This changes the dynamics slightly on the actual points here. If we just quickly gang all these together and kind of make them a little bit small, we don't really have to worry about where these points are at all. We can just sort of pick them up, move them around, because actually all we're really doing is tracking the perspective, not actually the four corners. We can also go in and add kind of like additional points as well, if we feel that we need some more tracking points to sort of work out that perspective surface. The rule is that we have to have at least 4 at any given time, but we can kind of turn these on and off. So once you've got something like that going, do like a little bit of tracking. It's going to kind of stop that, return back here, and you can see that even though we move those 4 corner points around, we're actually just tracking the perspective, which then gets applied to the surface. So perspective surface is a good option if you want to use it for doing things like corner pinning as a replacement to bilinear. New options when working with extended by cubics now allow us to go through and subdivide the mesh as we always could, but also merge the mesh back into something simpler. We can also preserve things like animation while we do this. So if we just subdivide this a couple of times to start off with, we're just going to go into our magnet tool, we're going to grab a load of points and move them here, grab a load of points and move them over there, and then kind of do the reverse on this one a little bit further up. We'll do this, something like this. You can see now that we obviously have like an animation going on. If you needed some more resolution for this mesh, you want to do some more finer work, we can come through and we can subdivide that several times, and the animation that's already there will be interpolated to the denser mesh. And once again, we can go through and we can make some kind of refinements to what we're working with. We want to make some sort of localized adjustments on this as well. We can also go that process backwards, but also be careful when merging back a denser mesh with animation to something simpler. If you go back too far, you will start to destroy the animation. But we do have the opportunity now to merge and subdivide extended by cubic meshes. Replicate is an interesting creative graphics tool that allows you to produce duplicates of pretty much any object inside of Action. To use Replicate, simply attach it to the object you want to duplicate or replicate, type in the amount of copies that you'd like, and then start playing with some of the offsets in position and rotation. Once you create your offsets, you can go back to the original parent axis of an object, you can move that around and then start manipulating either the rotation and scaling and other parameters inside the replicate node, or in fact inside of your master object axis like here. So you can see it's really easy. Once you start making the adjustments and start animating, you can create some really cool motion graphics kind of effects, and you can use replicate on pretty much any object, as we said. So here we're doing it on things like surfaces. You could also do it on 3D models. What's also nice for using textures if we use it on some of the lens flare presets. So here we have one of the lens flare presets, so we're just going to attach our replicate to this. Once again, type in X amount of copies, and then you can see as we start to manipulate these offsets and axes, we can create some interesting textures, things that look like stage lighting, just animating textures for motion graphics purposes and things like that. So really creative tool, Replicate. The introduction of 3D shape gave the artist the ability to create custom geometry within the action scene using G masks and multiple G masks attached to a 3D shape object. The 3D shape object allows us to do several things. It allows us to give physical volume or depth to the object, as well as adjust the edge profile in a variety of ways. We've added things like parametric bevel to easily shape and position the beveling of the edges, as well as bevel, rotation and scaling, all of which are profile driven and allow us to add custom points to further sculpt the geometry. Using multiple shapes and G masks attached to a 3D shape allows us to create quick and easy Boolean operations to start to construct more complex geometries for our scenes. 3D shape and G mask also allows us to import and pass SVG or scalable vector graphics into the action scene. This allows us to have continuously vectorized high quality graphics inside of our action scene for our motion graphics and other uses. It's also a great way of bringing in logos and graphics that have been made in other products that deal with SVG, such as Adobe Illustrator. So over the releases, lots of changes have happened to the lighting and rendering model inside of Action. We're just going to be quickly looking at IBL, image-based lighting. So image-based lighting we introduced quite some time ago. We can attach IBLs to either the camera or to any objects within the scene, just to make it a little bit more obvious what's going on here. We're just going to use that as back. So image-based lighting is in fact using, as the name suggests, another image, in this particular case a cityscape, to in fact light objects within the scene in a natural way. When we originally brought this out, we just had support for reflection. We now have support for ambient lighting as well, which is obviously a lot more softer. We're kind of casting tones and colours over the objects instead of using them as a reflection map. We've also done some things with texture and read files. So we're going to see read files a little bit more when we start looking at 3D objects coming in. But we also now give you 4 example IBLs to load into your scene and to play around with. And of course, you can either create your own or import more as you need. But IBL is a great way of naturally lighting your scene, particularly good if you're working with CGI elements or 3D models. It also ties in really nicely to the advancements and changes to the shader model and rendering engine of Action over the releases. So this is an incredibly useful feature addition, and it's to do with when we're working with extended by cubics. So if we just go and subdivide our plane a little bit, obviously when you're working with extended by cubics, we're kind of warping the image by moving, animating, or tracking these points. Now sometimes you don't actually want to distort the geometry. It would be quite nice if we could actually move the texture inside of that geometry. So if we just reset that back for a second, and in this view we're going to go to what we call our F8 view. So on the left hand side we've got the view of the surface, and on the right hand view in pink we've got the view of the texture. So once again, using our select tool, if we pick a point as we just did on the actual surface, you see that we're actually distorting that. Now inside the menu you've got 2 new options. There's a vertices and a UV points, because we can animate and track these independently, as well as copy the animation to and from the respective controls. But also in the tool selection we have a couple of extra tools that we can use. Slide texture, if we use it in the UV viewport, if we grab this, you can see there I'm not actually distorting the surface, but I'm actually moving the UV texture within that surface, which is really useful. There's one final feature here which is called Move UV Vertex, and this is particularly useful if you want to create things like explicit crops or patches on an image. What it does, it moves both the geometry and the UV points simultaneously. So let's have a look how that works. So I've reset my extended by cubics back to the default, just the 4 corner points, and I'm using my Move UV Vertex tool. So in either viewport, what's going to happen is I start to grab this, you can see because I'm moving not only the surface controls but also the texture controls, I'm in fact creating a custom explicit crop on the image. This is my result view, this is my view of the actual surface inside the action, and over here on the right hand side you can see the corresponding UV texture points are also being moved. At this point I can actually go through and then do things like create a more denser mesh and track objects inside of here to either stabilize textures or do more advanced texture mapping with animation onto the surfaces. So by splitting down the control points of the surface and the UVs, making extended by cubics much more flexible for use in compositing inside of Action for a variety of tasks. There's been some changes to the way that we process objects in the media list. So there's been some optimization on the rendering and the processing speed. Everything is now brought up to the same level as batch inside of Action, which is a good thing. There's been some certain re-interfacing here as well, so things like lock, which are generally, we just had sort of like a lock was on or off, but you never really knew what frame you were locking. If you kind of scrub through here, now you can see what actual frame you're locked on, which is kind of quite nice. Things obviously like slipper as before. You're also going to notice that color correct and color warper are tools that we can have on simultaneously. So here if we do some work in the color warper, something like this, make it nice and magenta color, we can actually have the color corrector on at the same time, and then we can go through and we can add some tools that are not present in the color warp inside of here, so sort of like gamma tools, something like that, which is quite good. Things like blur as they were before, so we can blur in X and Y for the front and matte, which is good. But if you treble click on the little tick box under the blur, we get access to the full-blown blur tool from Batch, which is quite nice, with all the various modes inside of there. So if we do something like radial, and we do something like this, we can get access to all of these tools that were part of the Batch blur tool, but we get those directly inside of Action, which is good. Changes to animation, which is a welcome thing. So once before, animation of the media layers was only sort of visible internally while you're in those modules. but now, because of the change in the media list and the processing pipeline, if we do something really nice and obvious, some animation over time, this is going to look gorgeous. So something like that. So now we have an animating color corrector over time. If we look into our animation editor now, anything that's animating in these media lists, these media slots inside of Action is available at the global animation editor for inside Batch. So here we can see our other objects inside of Batch. Here's our action, and here's the animation that we've just put onto the color corrector inside of that action. So lots of good changes to the media list, optimization in pipeline and rendering, as well as also some enhanced functionality when it comes to animation and the way that we work with those tools. More improvements in Action now, and this is to do with Matchbox. Matchbox shaders we originally introduced inside of Batch as a tool that you could put inside of the flow graph. But we introduced those into Action as a way of enhancing and being able to apply effects to media layers in the Action environment, and it's very useful. You're going to see that there's a Matchbox tab in our tool bin for Action down here, and it's really as simple as doing just selecting the layer that we want to apply the effect to and dragging out a Matchbox shader. Also in the All Nodes bin, if we look for a Matchbox shader, that will take you to the browser where you can load up external GLSL shaders from various sources. We're going to be using the Matchbox that are directly inside of here. Now you can see I've done a particularly bad key. We're going to be using this for another video in a minute. But there's some nice tools inside of here that you wouldn't expect. Something like Parallax Spread. So Parallax Spread is a tool that we have outside in Batch. It takes the form of pixel spread. But here we've got a similar tool that we can actually start doing that same sort of process live inside of Action, which is really nice. Now what's good is that we can stack up multiple effects on a layer. So if I wanted to do some color correct to then sort of blend her a little bit more into the backplate, it's simply bringing out another tool, making sure that it's parented up, and then we can start to use some things like contrast just to make that look just a little bit sort of better. Very nice. Now of course we can apply multiple effects to multiple layers. So on my background we're going to put my old favorite, a little bit of chromatic aberration onto this one, just to make it look really sort of chromatically aberrated, I guess is the word. But then maybe we want to share an effect between these two layers. So maybe we've got things balanced out, but we want to do a global color correct onto both. So we're going to attach it to this particular layer, but if we actually parent up to multiple layers, then this effect is going to be modifying both those media layers. So once again, if we came in here and we just made the saturation really sort of saturated, and then maybe just sort of gave it an overall cast like this, you can see that on top of all the effects we've now got one effect that is affecting multiple layers. Also worth noting that in the media layer for things now, especially when you're working with matchboxes and G masks and lights, etc., if we swipe down we have multiple priority editors. So we have one for all objects in Action, we have for Matchbox only, lights and G masks. And what this means is that for any given layer we can affect the actual processing order of how these effects are applied to the layer. So the top is our result, this is processed next, this is processed first. So by moving these around we in some cases can change the overall effect that those shaders have on the image. So Matchbox in Action. So Matchbox in Action was such a great idea, we thought we'd extend the same thing to lights, and surprisingly enough do a thing called Lightbox. Once again, Lightbox has its own node bin down here, but if we do all nodes and look for Lightbox, we can drag this out and it will take you to the Lightbox browser. Now by and large, most of these are color correction or look development tools, but the whole point is that we can now project and limit these through the cone of a light, and also attach some G master lights as well to further limit them. There's some really useful ones in here. There's also some volumetric effects as well, but we're going to look at some stuff that's not typically a color corrector but like a color suppress. So with Lightbox on a light, the default functionality of the light to light things is kind of disabled. When you put a Lightbox on, nothing's really going to happen in the scene. We still have the light. We could actually still make the light light things by turning it on and actively rendering it. But by default, when you drag it out of the Lightbox, it knows that you're actually going to be projecting effect down. Once again, you can use these as directional tools. You can change the type of light that we have. So we're going to change ours to a spot for a second. And what's kind of nice about this, we kind of zoom in a little bit, is that in this particular case we can do things like localized color suppressing. So this is the reason why I did this really horrendous key. Normally you would do a color suppress outside as part of the keying process, but sometimes maybe if you've got like a badly lit or uneven chroma key background, One color suppress value is not going to satisfy all the different elements, and this way is quite a nice way of localizing that in different ways. The tool works exactly the same way as it does outside in batch. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of pick our color suppress color, which is going to be our green. In our color suppress tools down here, we're also going to pick the same color green there as well. That's going to give me a plot down here. If we look back at our result view for a second and we just add a point around about there and start to drag that down, what you're going to see is that I'm actually suppressing through the cone of a light the green in that particular area. So you can see that the area where this is pointing to, no more green. The area where it's not pointing to, still green. So using tools like this in conjunction with things like parallax spread inside of Action, you can actually achieve a lot of the results that you would have normally done inside of batch. It's really useful. The other thing that you can do with this as well is you can attach G-masks. So we're limiting the effect of this light box via the cone of a light. But if you so wished, you could come in. We could sort of add just a bog standard G-mask inside of here, and we could just draw an area that we wanted to limit. And just like everything else, what we would then do is we would use our G-mask link tool, and we can say that this is only going to affect this light. And then what will happen now is that a combination of the G-mask and the cone of the light will limit the light box effect. So just before we leave Lightbox, some other things that we're just going to quickly look at to do with Lightbox. In the Lightbox browser, as you can see, there's loads of color correct and look treatments, but there's also some stuff that deals with casting 3D volumes in space. We'll talk about a little bit more when we look at camera effects. So some selective 3Ds, there's various ways that we can select in volumes, but there's some shaders in here that will actually cast a 3D volume in space. We're going to look quickly at this fog one. So here's a little 3D scene set up in space. I've got some 3D text that says near, middle, and you can't read that one, and some 3D geometry along the side as well. This particular Lightbox shader is a fog caster, so it's actually casting a 3D volume in space. If we change the color of that for a second, it's now casting a yellow throughout. So I'm going to change it back to black for a second. But the whole point is that through a Lightbox shader, we can actually cast volume. So this is not really lighting these objects, because it just light everything kind of evenly. We're actually generating like a 3D volume that's a particular color, or a fog in 3D space. So these Lightbox shaders actually do work in a 3D environment, and that theme continues when we start looking at camera effects as well. So let's talk about lights. Lots of lighting changes in respect of supporting the new rendering and functionality inside of Action, but we're going to have a quick whistle-stop tour through what's new in lights. So starting with the light themselves, and we've still got all the light types that we had before. Down here we've got free and target lights now. So target lights, we have another axis that we can obviously parent to, or animate, or track to, which is kind of quite nice. Now we still have things like spread and etc. and decays. But if we go down to the profile, we've added a parametric fall off. It's still the old curve custom one, but the parametric one is kind of just like a little bit more easy to operate and gives you a nice soft kind of fall off. So parametric curve fall off, a little bit like the bevel adjustments that we had in 3D shape, etc. There's also two additional tabs if you're using a Lightbox shade on a light, and also if we're looking at G-masks. So G-masks allow us to limit the output of a light through a G-mask as well. If we just have a quick look at this, I've got a G-mask floating around in space, and you can see the default behavior is that it's cutting a big hole through everything inside the scene. However, if I go through and I link that G-mask to a particular light, what it's doing now is it's working in combination with the cone to further restrict the output of the light. And you can see you can kind of use these as like a gobo. When they're attached to a light, they cease to be a mask that cuts through the scene, and they're literally just limiting the effect of the light output. So that's a really useful little feature. Sometimes if you're working with multiple lights, it's a bit hard to arrange them in the scene. So if we have a light selected and we hit F8, what we actually can do now is look through a light as if it was a camera, and that kind of helps us to then line up where the light should actually be projecting through. So at the moment I'm tilting it down like this. If I look back at my camera result viewer for a second, you can see that I was looking through the camera, I was pointing it down, and this is the result of that in the scene. So F8 allows us to look through the light as an object, which is really good. Some new things you're going to notice in the rendering. Obviously the light can be active or not active. Additive lights we'll look at in a moment. But we've got this button down here called Scene Ambient. and also shading. So shading, once again, turns off on and off shadings it says, but scene ambient is a general global illumination light. So this is kind of the default lighting model. If you haven't got any lights in the scene, it's invisible ambient lights are always there. That can also be accessed down in the rendering preferences. You can control the intensity of this as well as also the default shading. And once again, you can mix and match this. We can actually have a light active in combination with the scene ambient at the same time. So some nice options down here just to be aware of if you're looking for where shading is and wonder what the scene ambient does. It's a global illumination light. So back with working with our lights now. What we're going to do is we're going to turn on an additional 2 lights, and our original light we've been looking at, I'm just going to change into green. So in the default method of working with lights, they are always in what we call additive mode. Under the blue drop down, we can actually turn these into what we call solo lights, and solo lights purely allow us to project the color of the light without it blending in with other lights that are in the scene. Once again, you can do this on a light by light basis, but it's this kind of quite a nice option creatively, depending on what kind of effect you want your lighting to have. Finally, when you're working with multiple lights, once again, these could also have lightbox effects on them. If we go and swipe down in the media list, you can see that whenever we select a light, we automatically go into the lights priority editor. And once again, here you can arrange the lights in the order which they draw, and also any lightbox effects which are attached to those lights as well. So here's a nice little enhancement with a feature called Look At links. So what we've got here in our little scene is an arrow. And I've pre-animated 3 characters, 1, 2, 3, and they all do kind of different things moving around in space. Now, if we want this arrow to follow a particular object, we used to be able to do this through expressions, but expressions can get a little bit complicated, and sometimes it's nice to have a graphical way of doing it. So this is our arrow, and these are our 3 objects, 1, 2, and 3, which have the animation on. We go down to our tool chest, and we go to our Look At link. This enables us to connect an axis to look at another object. So if I connect my arrow to number 1 and I scrub through, you can see now what's happening is that my arrow will follow object number 1. And if I sever that and connect it number 2, it will now follow number 2, and so on and so forth. Now, sometimes you like actually to get that to animate over time. So with this graphical way of getting objects to look at other objects, we can actually animate that over time as well. So if we turn on our animation button and say, well, to start off with, I want my arrow to look at object number 1 until maybe the animation starts to move on number 2, and I can say, well, round about that frame, I would like it to then start to look at object number 2. And you can see what it's done now is it's starting to look at object number 2 at that point. And then we're going to go a little bit further down through this and wait till object number 3 starts to animate, and somewhere around about there. And I draw out another link saying at this point I would like it to start following number 3. And if we go back to the head of the timeline, the arrow following the objects, and at those keyframes will transition over to the other object. So it's following number 1 until it's number 2. It follows number 2 until I ask it to look at number 3. And then it's going to follow number 3 all the way through to the end. This is expressed in the animation editor as a Look At link. So if we look at this, we've got our Look At curve here, and we can go through and we can modify the points at which that transition happens. So animating Look At links is a really nice way of getting objects to follow other objects without all that complicated expression stuff. It's worth looking at. We're going to be looking at some changes to the node preferences inside of Action. Over the course of releases, there's been updates and changes to rendering preferences and adaptive degradation menus. But in the rendering, we've got some options down here when it comes to working with scene linear material. So Action is fully scene linear compliant for compositing, but you've got some options down here where you can override that behavior. As much as clamp color output. So if you don't want values to go below 0 above 1, you can physically clamp colors coming out of Action. And also sometimes when you're working with values that are below 0 and above 1, and you're doing compositing with mats and multiplication, sometimes that can give you unpredictable results, and you can also clamp the divide at that point as well, so things behave a little bit more predictably. Down here we've got an overscan option. So overscan renders out more pixels, either for physical output or for internal use when you're calculating things like glows or blurs. It sort of supersedes the idea of changing the resolution of your action and then applying and scaling, which in some circumstances, especially if you're doing tracking and masking, can give you slightly unpredictable results. This physically increases the output size of the action. So here I've got my lens flare, and the real world, obviously you'd have, it wouldn't be cut off at the edge, you'd have a bit more going out this way, and we'll have a bit more of a lens flare coming down here. And you may want to have a bit more canvas room to work with downstream in batch. So, and the render out, if we change this to 150%, the actual resolution of the action still is at 1920 1080, but we're rendering out 50% more pixels already. You can see that we've got a bit more canvas. When we go downstream into another action, which is 1920 1080 still, and we pick this up, you can see that we've actually now got 50% more pixels. If we actually select the layer, you can see that I've actually got this amount of room to play around with. It gives me a bit more elbow room, and it's quite a good way of working. Sometimes it's quite advantageous. Another time where it's good to have extra pixels is when you're doing the old trick of stabilizing something, correcting, and then inverting the stabilizer to recreate the plate. So here what I've got is this pan around of a building. In my first action here, I've done a perspective grid track on this. And there is a bit of a trick with this where we can stabilize and correct the perspective in one go. So if we hook this up to our original layer that we were tracking, we change this to a 2D transform and invert the stabilization, you can see now what we get here is actually the perspective corrected and the track stabilized, the movement. But if we zoom out, we can see that the actual layer now is much bigger than our 1920 1080. So when we were to go through the process of doing our corrective work on this and inverting stabilization, we wouldn't actually be able to make up the plates because we don't have all the information. This is a good opportunity to use this overscan. So if we increase this to around about 300% extra, and we kind of zoom back now, you can see that what we've got is the entire contents of that track are now contained within the canvas size, which is what we want. So if we came out of this action and we went down and did our corrective work, in this particular case I've drawn something in that says my flat, and because it's obviously all stabilized up and nothing is kind of moving, we're just working at this point on a static plate as far as movement. And then in an action downstream from here, which was duplicated, we now want to invert that stabilization and perspective correction. So we go into the perspective tool, we turn off invert, we take it back to a 3D transform, and we go back to the beginning on this, and you can see that everything gets recorrected back out. Now because we duplicate the action, the rendering is still set for 300%, so if we go and change that back to 100, then you can see here that what we're back to is where we started, but with our corrective work, or my sort of cheesy little handwritten sign on top. So render out is a really good option for when you're doing things like stabilization or just need an extra bit of canvas. Remember, it's in the no preferences. So after Matchbox and Lightbox effect, it made sense that we could apply effects directly to the camera. We call these camera effects. Down your action node bin under the Matchbox, we can pretty much apply any of the Matchbox effects to the camera. If you look for things that begin with S, you can see a whole bunch of Stingray shaders. So these are shaders that we've used some of the code from the Stingray engine, and we've utilized that inside of Action to accelerate things that are normally processor heavy. So our little 3D scene's got some animation. We've got some cogs moving around and animating. Kind of zoom in a little bit on our scene. We've got a Stingray motion blur effect, so if we hook the camera up to that, you can see what we're going to get is realistic real-time motion blur based on the speed of the objects that are moving. Once again, all these shader effects go directly through the GPU to accelerate performance. Ambient occlusion or contact shadows is really nice as well. If we grab all these groups and move them closer or away from another surface, you can see that we get realistic dirt shadows or ambient occlusion, as well as internal to the geometry. Blooming is provided. We can bloom based on the intensity and also set thresholds for different properties as well. And most of these shader effects, you're going to see different ways of selecting the range or what area you want to work on. So depth, distance, physical volumes relative to the object of the world or the camera, normals and color selectives. Depth of field again is a processor heavy effect. So inside of here we can have a viewing range based on depth of field, or where actually we want our sharpness to be, plus the range either side of that. And you can see now that based on this we can do real-time camera depth of field based on that through that shader. Other effects that you didn't have previously access to are things like reflections. So through the reflections Stingray shader we can do camera based scene reflections, not only on surfaces but also internal to objects as well. And once again, reflections have extra properties on where they cast and how they received based on these different parameters that we looked at earlier. General matchbox effects can also be applied to the camera. So here we've got a small selection. Things like blur, we're actually blurring 3D geometry in 3D space, still maintaining the ability to go around and orbit those objects and look at them. Dots, once again, is a pixelation effect that we're applying, but again this is being applied in a 3D space as we orbit and dolly the camera around the scene. Distortion effects can also be added through the camera, and this is going to affect everything in the scene. However, what we've got up here is a G-mask, and by default the G-mask is cutting a hole through everything in the scene. However, if we hook the G-mask up to the actual camera and then tell the specific effect to use the G-mask input, we can then manipulate the G-mask around and we can get that distortion effect to happen only in certain places. Once again, this is happening in a 3D space, so as we orbit our camera around and manipulate our G-mask, we are actually only distorting or warping the areas that are cutting through that G-mask. So that's a brief tour around camera effects, but I hope you can see that this is a real big improvement on the way that we can work and be creative inside the action environment. What you also may have noticed is that we're also previewing these effects live, and this is down to the change in the viewport rendering that we've now got. Flame and action now default to this live preview mode down here. If we toggle that off back to the legacy 3D mode, we're not going to see any of those post-processing effects that are done by the camera. However, in the 3D mode, we do have access to see objects outside the canvas as we did previously. But working in the default preview mode will crop the output of the viewport to the boundaries of the action resolution. Shadow casting has also had a big improvement in quality and performance. If we turn on our shadow cast node down here, we can see that a couple of things have changed in the parameters. Shadows are now calculated at 32-bit. The legacy value of 16-bit is still available, but in this mode you're probably going to see some artifacts. So 32-bit is now the default. You're also going to see an increase in the size of the shadow maps by default from 2, 4 and 8K were available depending on your graphics card configuration and the system that you're using. All in all, these improvements now make shadows of a much higher quality, more responsive, and when you're using things like linear decay or one of the decay modes, a lot more photorealistic within the action scene. A little thing now, but the addition of being able to create and save your own lens flare presets. So if we just go into the presets for lens flares, I'm just going to look at all the subdirectories here for a second. We're just going to load one of these up. I'm going to make some modifications of it to make it unique. So I particularly like green lens flares, they're really nice, and what we're going to do is we're going to double up on some of these. So we're just going to duplicate that out, hook that back in, and then we're just going to sort of adjust some of the positions of some of these streaks and rotation of some of those elements as well. So now I've got something that's a bit more custom for what I actually need to work with. Looks really nice, and I want to save that configuration. Down the lens flare I can now load and save. So if I save this, it's going to take me to a preset. Directory. I'm going to call this Stewie Green. Save that up. Now what I can do is using the load button, I can go and browse all my lens flares. I can pick one, I can load that back up into the action scene exactly as I left it. So lens flare presets, the ability to create and save and load your own presets. Create camera is a new feature inside of Action. It allows us to create a new camera from the working camera view inside the action scene. So here's my little 3D scene. I've got my jet fighter doing a fly past on a sky. Now sometimes when you're working in the working or perspective view camera, you may stumble upon a better view or something you like to use as a cutaway. So here I am in my perspective or working camera view, and as I navigate around the scene and sort of do some dollies in, I actually may get something that looks a little bit more dramatic, sort of something like a 3/4 underside or something like this. That looks pretty good. That'd be maybe nice as an alternative camera view or an output or even a cutaway. From that view, if I do spacebar C, in my action schematic you can see I've now created a new camera. And I can carry on and do this as many times as I want. Maybe it'd be nice to have like a reverse view looking towards the other horizon, something like this. As the jet goes through, that will be also quite nice as a cutaway. And once again, if I do spacebar C, I can then create another new camera. Going back to my default camera, you can see that I've still got all my original settings there. But in the camera list now, I can toggle through to see the alternative angles that I generated through the working camera view. From here, I can either output these as separate render passes, or I can actually animate through the cameras as part of the render process from Action. That's create camera from working view. So we're going to look at all the changes in navigation, widgets and manipulation, and there's quite a lot going on. So without further ado, let's crack on with this. So navigation in general and widgets and manipulation have changed significantly inside of Action, not only in the schematic but also in the viewport. Pretty much brings it into alignment with the way that you manipulate and navigate viewports inside of Maya. So if we kind of look in our schematic for starters, we've got a couple of objects here. You can see we've got some fighter jets, all very exciting. We can now multi-select, shift select and move multiple objects around. You're going to see that this is exactly the same as we do inside of Batch now, as opposed to doing an Alt shift down. We can actually select multiple objects and we can kind of move those around independently. So that's good stuff. We've also got some navigation for the actual framing and selection of it. So, say you're working on like a big schematic and things get a bit lost. If we do spacebar A over that viewport, it will frame everything. And if we have a selected object, if we do spacebar F, it will frame and center that object. So spacebar A and spacebar F allows you to quickly navigate around your schematic. This is also the same in the viewport. So we're going to look at the manipulators in a second, but spacebar A and spacebar F perform similar functions. So here at the moment we're looking at my result view. If I go spacebar A, what will happen is it will frame all the objects in the viewport through the working camera. So this is a little bit different how we used to go into the working camera before. If you remember, we went spacebar F4. We're going to do spacebar A, will take us into our working camera view. Now if you make a selection of a particular object inside of there and do spacebar F, it will now, like in the schematic view, it will now center and frame that selected object. Now not only that, but it also sets the point of rotation for the working camera around that object. So once again, it makes it a lot easier to manipulate and start looking and moving around inside your viewport for the working camera. So while we've got some stuff selected, let's talk about other navigation modes inside of not only the working camera but also for the result camera as well. So I'm using a Wacom pen and tablet. You can use a mouse as well, but the hotkeys on the Wacom is that if I want to orbit around anything, if I hold down the Alt key on the keyboard and then just drag around my pen, I can orbit. If I do Control and Alt, that allows me to dolly in and out, and if I do Alt and Shift, that allows me to pan around the views. And if we go back to our result view for a second, those same hotkeys, those same navigation allows me to directly manipulate and interact with the current camera. So dollying, orbiting and panning around to frame my views. So just a lot easier than the method that we used to have in some of the previous releases. So we've just hidden a few of those jets for a second because we're going to look at manipulating actual objects. So one of the changes is that just to select an object now, we can just tap anywhere in it, and that just takes us into a selection mode. There's no danger of me kind of accidentally moving it on that first tap, but then it does activate a boundary box, and we can also change that as well. So the default now is this bounding box, but we can go wireframe and bounding box. But it also activates the widget for the axis or the manipulator. So let's just zoom in a little bit on this for a second. So you can see here we've got an axis that looks very much like, or a manipulator that looks very much like you'd expect to find inside of Maya. Now selecting the middle of this puts us into free movement, but obviously then selecting any of the arrows will constrain the movement to that particular direction. Now you're also going to see that we've also got some patches, some color patches in here as well. And what these do is allow you to move the object excluding that particular axis. So like the red one will allow us to move it in Y and Z, and it excludes X. This will exclude Y. This will exclude Z. So you're kind of moving it in just in two planes. The other thing that we've got is a quick hotkey way of going through or cycling through the different manipulation modes. So at the moment I'm in move or translate mode, and that's assigned to the T hotkey. If I go to R, that takes me into the rotate tool. You can see here I can limit the rotation axis by grabbing onto one of these, and once again if you grab into the middle of there you've got free rotation. And E takes me into scaling, and once again if I go to the middle of the scaling manipulator I do it proportionally. If I do it on any particular axis I'm doing it unproportionately. And in the scaling you've also got the way to scale excluding one of the other planes, as we did have in the manipulator mode. So it's E for scale, R for rotate, T for translate. We also now have different axis orientation modes. So if I come back out to my working camera view for a moment, so this is my working camera view. At the moment I'm in what we call object orientation, which means that my axes are kind of aligned with the orientation of my object, as you can see here. We've got a couple of other modes as well. If we go to world mode, then regardless of the rotation of the object, you can see here that my object is actually rotated away from the camera. The axes are always going to point in a consistent direction, a world direction. And sometimes it's just easier to manipulate objects having everything pointing in the same direction if you've got multiple things. We've got one more here called the camera, and the camera orientation will only ever present you with two visible axis movements. So if I'm looking sort of roughly side on to my jet here, and you can see I can move it effectively what will be in Z and what will be in Y. But then if I kind of look at the object from the working camera head on, you can see now that I can only really move it in X and Y, not Z. So the axes are always in alignment with the camera view and just limits you to the movement of how you're looking at the object. So a couple of last things before we move on to something else. We also have some group selection modes as well. So if I box select a bunch of axes and I do the hotkey spacebar M, it takes me into multi-axis mode, which means everything that I've got selected, I'm through the sliders, I'm going to manipulate all together. So here you see in multi-axis mode, if I select these and I do X, Y, Z or the rotation, I can actually manipulate all those objects at once. And the clue here is the multi-axis label on the tab. If I do spacebar M again, that takes me out of multi-axis mode, and then I'm back into whatever I've actually got selected. So that's quite nice as well. And of course these manipulators are available for any object within the scene. So if I've got my camera is going to have the same kind of manipulators. The difference will be on rotation, depends on whether it's a target or free camera. My lights, if I just unhub my light for a second, will also have exactly the same manipulator mechanism. I can go through and rotate. So once again, it's a great improvement on the manipulators and navigation that we had before, and also it's consistent with other areas of Flame, as we'll see a bit later on. So in this we're going to have a whistle-stop tour through the changes to the rendering engine to do with PBR, physically based rendering, and physically based shading within Action. So we've got a couple of geometries in here. We've got one of the new Maya Hypershade objects as well, just to show you how this works. We've got two lights on the scene, just lighting our objects up. These will be relevant in a second. We've got some other things that we're going to turn on and turn off. First off though, we're going to look at this shader. So when we turn shaders on, if they're not attached to anything inside of the scene, they're going to affect everything, all the objects inside of there. Obviously if we parent a shader up to a particular geometry, then it's only going to affect that. Now PBR and PBS shading by and large works best when we start working with IBLs, image-based lighting as well. So here we've got a camera and we've got one of our default IBLs, and we're just going to unhide that for a second. Now you can use standard lights in conjunction with this, but we find that it tends to look a little bit nicer for these purposes if we turn the two point lights off for a second. So what this shader is doing at the moment is it's controlling the surface properties of all the objects because it's not attached to anything in the scene. You can see down here that in our shader tab it defaults to physically based. We've got all the other options underneath that we had before. physically based is now the default. And by and large, we're controlling a couple of things. We're controlling sort of like the roughness or the mattness of the surface, you can see here. And we're also then playing around with how reflective that surface is as well. Now, like I said, we can attach multiple shaders in scene. So at the moment, this is affecting everything. If we want to compare these up, but here we've also got a shader that is just linked to our ground plane. So once again, we can then independently play around with the reflectivity or the properties of different surfaces, so you can kind of fine tune it. So you can find the shader node in the node bin, go all nodes, look for S for shader, drag it out, and you can start working with it. The other thing that we've got inside of Action is PBS maps. Now PBS maps, as we've got here, allow you to customize what is actually going to be applied to a surface, so we get all different properties. Now what we mean by that, what I mean by that, is we come out to our batch schematic. What I've got here is I've drawn, very crudely, a whole bunch of textures. So we've got like a bit of a yellow triangle thing, we've got some white lines, we've got like a white square, and we've got, this is our white background that we're using inside the scene. So on this particular object, so don't forget, if we select that and go spacebar F, we can come in and look at that, we can frame that up. So what we're going to be doing on this particular object now is we're going to be using the media that's inside of our media list, and we're going to be attaching that to a geometry via the PBS map. Now the PBS map allows us to do various things. So on this one, we go down to the properties, and I'm going to turn this one on. In my list of properties inside the PBS map, I can control different attributes of the physically based shader. So you see here I can affect the opacity, the ambient occlusion, metallic, roughness, and base color. So this one, this is my white line that I drew. I've set to opacity, and basically what it's doing now via PBS is it's controlling the opacity of that object. So if we came in here and we kind of rotated the object around, you can see that actually what I'm doing is I'm cutting like a kind of like a crisp, curly, whirly, quaver kind of shape out, using that as a transparency map. This is quite nice. By using that square map and change it to metallic, I can actually control the reflectivity in a very localized way on that surface. So I guess you're kind of getting the idea now that whatever we feed in, depending on the property that we're using on the PBS material, we can control those things. And this one, we're doing something even more simple. We can actually control either globally throughout the whole object, or as you can see here by the shape we've drawn, the actual base color of an object as well. So this is kind of like a way of sticking a transfer on or a texture in a certain way, but it's actually a base color that we're using. Now what's nice about this is that we can actually also have multiples of these on any given time. So I can say that this is going to be my base color, but also in this area it's going to be quite reflective, and actually I want to cut out a certain section of it by using the transparency map. So you can see that's a very flexible way, it's a very manual way that you can build up your own PBS maps and using PBR shading actually on these objects. So we've got one more little trick with PBRs before we look at something else, and that's to do with substance PBR. So if we go into our node bin and look for substance PBRs and drag that out onto a geometry, this is going to take me to a browser where we can browse all the substance PBRs that are included with the system. So these have been created to have different properties. You can see we've got quite a mixture as default. We've got some fabrics, we've got some metals, some wood, some stone. When you start playing around with these, you're going to see that there's different elements built into the shader that you can kind of work with. These are all actually built through algorithmic substance design as well. So if you want to go and, or if you've got a license on that, you can actually go and use that. So here what we've done is that we've applied that PBR, that shader, to this part of the geometry, this geometry here. Now when you do this, this looks a little bit like substance node that we had before, and it actually is, except this is a physically based shader that's being built up, and you can see that we've got all the different elements inside here as well, and this is the central control for everything. Now when you do this, it puts a shader node in, but the shader node is pretty much redundant. It won't actually do anything into our scene because it's just there to facilitate this construct working on your geometry. But what you do have is the properties that you would normally adjust inside the shader broken out as separate elements. So here we've got one for the metallicness of the object. You can see I can make it a bit more metallic, and the roughness you're just going to be adjusting in a slightly different way. You've also got things for reflections and normal maps and ambient occlusion. If you double tap on the main control, the thing that has substance PBR on it, you get some more advanced options as well. So, you know, the things like the texture size. But depending on how the PBR has been built, you're going to find that you've got different parameters inside of here. So one of the ones that you get on this nice metallic paint one is that we can go through and we can start deciding on, you know, how much peeling of the paint, how much rust is on there. And on some of the other shaders, you're going to get different parameters depending on how it's being built. So that very quickly is our new shader technology, PBR, physically based rendering and physically based shading inside of Action. You can see there's a variety of things you can do, and also don't forget that you've also got the camera effects that you can also apply on them just for an added bit of realism. The ambient occlusion and things like reflection really make this start to stand out. In case you forget, start trying to work with IBLs when you're using them. They give you the best results and the most photorealistic look. So another fundamental change to Action to do with the rendering is the way that we deal with our outputs. So the output menu has changed slightly. So we've now got render layers and render passes. That's more in alignment with what you'd expect out of a 3D product like Maya. But also the way that we reuse some of these render passes internally as well. So here's we've got spaceship fighters now. This is very exciting. We've moved on from atmospheric fighters to spaceborne fighters. When we do our comp, obviously the default output, the render layer and render pass for this, as we now call it, is the primary composition, which is our final result. Now down the list here, we've got all these parameters that are sort of kind of constantly there. And if we're using shaders inside the scene, and in this particular case you can see that we've got some nice motion blur on these, it will actually be using the motion blur render pass, if you like, looped back internally into Action and reused by that shader. And once again, if we were using some things like Z depth, then it will be looking and using the respective Z depth pass to drive that shader inside of Action. So effectively these are already being generated, and as we use shaders within the scene, the shader will automatically pick up on what pass it needs to use. But if we want to start outputting some render layers and render passes, or objects and their respective passes separately, this also allows us to streamline that process a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to create, actually before we do that, we're going to look at our outputs a moment. So this is our Action output inside of Batch. You can see it's just the primary comp layer. And if we add a new output, and we're just going to rename that, and we'll just call it, let's just call it Green 1. That's the fighter name. We've now got a Green 1 output, and by default nothing's really selected for that at all. All of our schematic is grayed out. So if we go into the Edit Output menu, and we're going to select all of our cameras and our lights, because we kind of want those on, that would be kind of good to have. And then I know that the fighter that we want is going to be this one down here, so we're going to select all those and the textures, and they are now all going to be part of this render layer. And once again, by default, it's just going to output basically the beauty of this. But if we want to use some of this downstream inside a Batch, then maybe it'd be good to have the matte. So we're going to activate the matte. Now, when we start selecting these, we can either just view what the pass is, or if we tap on the little button, we look at our outputs here, it will start actually adding these to the outputs for that particular render layer. So on some 3D motion, I'd like to have some Z depth for where it is, so we're going to add that as well, and maybe something like the ambient occlusion as well. So we can go and find ambient occlusion, and we can turn that on. And now what we're going to have within this is going to be those passes. So in the viewport, to sort of toggle through these, obviously F4 is going to take you back to your default, but the 1 and 2 buttons will toggle you through all of your available outputs that you've got enabled for this particular render layer. So it's a little thing, but it's a nice streamlining, and like I said, this render passes can be either selected to be used outside in Batch, or they will be used internally by the shaders that we apply as part of the new render engine inside of Action. Two quick ones here to do with 3D models, import and export. So we've got an empty action scene here, a couple of lights, and we now got a contextual menu for importing and exporting FBX models and 3D models that we bring in, geometry. So if we import, we're going to go down to our FBXs. We're going to bring in one of these hypershade ones again. Some changes to the import menus. We can convert this to actual action objects, which is kind of like the standard behavior. So here we've got our object group in. Kind of undo that. If we import that again, that same object, but we change it to a read file, we now have a live link to the read file. This then brings in those geometries as an FBX scene. Now, this allows me to do a couple of things in one go here. So this is an FBX scene. Obviously, this is my model coming in, but you're going to notice that the menu has changed somewhat down here. We can now cache this, so we can actually make it part of the scene instead of it being a read file, but in this mode it is a default read file. And we also do have some more parameters where we can modify global adjustments on it, so things like doing sorting and false two-side shading and stuff. Now it brings it in as a group. And there's been some major changes in groups as well. So this is coming in as an FBX scene. We're going to do the same thing with the traditional way of importing. But essentially now, groups inside of Action, whether they come in like this or you make themselves, are sub-schematics. So we can actually go into the group, we can modify, we can add some stuff, and you can see that we've actually still got the rest of the action scene grayed out. So tilde takes us back to the action level. F8 will take us into that group. Now there's some interesting additions to workflow on this as well. So the idea is that we could have multiple objects grouped within here because this makes it convenient to work with. But before, in the old behavior, it was always a bit of a pain to try and attach things in. So we've got an intelligent parenting mechanism now. So if we brought out things like an axis, and maybe we bring out a material, and maybe we bring out a shader, and we can actually hook these into the hierarchy of the group external to it without going inside. So if we parent the axis in, you can see that we've got this dotted line. If we do our shader, so I'm going to hook that in, we've got a dotted line there. And once again, if we do like our material as well, all dotted lines. Now what this actually means, if we go into the group again, is that it intelligently works out what it needs to parent things up on. So you can see here that the material node has been parented up. We've got a global axis that is parented up. These are external to the group, but they are all selectable and modifiable either inside the group or outside the group. So it's just a nice way of being able to work with objects quite quickly and simply with groups. And like I said, you can actually create these groups yourself as well. So just resetting the scene quickly, I'm going to bring in two objects. I'm going to bring in an FBX plane. And we're just going to rotate that around, make it kind of like a little bit bigger. So I've got lights in here. And I'm also going to bring in that same hypershade object as well. So now we've got a couple of things going on. Let's move that down a little bit. Now, as you may have seen before, we have in our contextual also the ability to export FBX models. So before we could export things like location points and cameras. Now we can export a variety of objects inside with some textures and some animation. If we go export, and I'm just going to go to a location here, we can save all supported objects, or we can just do the selected objects that we've got inside the scene. I'm going to give that a name. We're going to call it Stewie Model. I'm just going to save that. Come back out into our batch, bring out a new action. I'm going to pop inside of here for a second, and we're going to go and import that same model. And once again, you've got all those same options where you bring in. Notice down here that we've got the option to bring in models, lights, cameras, mesh animations, normals, create media. So this has been once again slightly changed and modified, brought up to date. Loading that in brings in all those elements that we had. It's going to tidy up the schematic quickly. And once again, if we come down to our new camera from the scene, and we go into our node preferences, and we activate some shading, things like that, and turn off the scene ambient, you can see that what we've actually done is re-imported that exported model that we had in the previous action with all the objects. So it's really nice. So we've got groups, the improvements to groups, the way we bring in 3D models, and also now the ability to export 3D geometry and lights and some textures and some animation back out to an FBX scene.
New in Flame 2017 Extension 1, Active Color Management simplifies and automates the process of working with and viewing media in multiple color spaces. Active Color Management is prevalent throughout Extension 1, from the revised Color Management Preferences tab to Media Hub settings, active viewports, and new Color Management node in Batch. Media can now be tagged or converted either manually or automatically through import and viewing rules. If you'd like Flame to handle media color spaces and viewport transforms automatically, you can take advantage of setting up a complete project color policy in the Preferences tab. Once this is set, Flame will take care of correct tagging, conversions, and viewport settings throughout the application. In the Media Hub, we can choose various options, from full management and conversion to the project's working space, tagging only, or using custom LUTs and CTFs. Using file metadata or rules, Flame dynamically switches the viewport depending on the media's color space to always give the artist the correct view, implementing on-the-fly transforms depending on content, working space, and display devices. Having a working color space and policy for the project simplifies compositing work as well. By unifying all your media to a single standard of your choice, it allows for easy combining of video, scene linear, log, and multiple camera formats. Working in a scene linear or ACES color space makes deliveries to other formats much easier and maintains maximum quality. Of course, you can always choose to work without Flame managing everything automatically, but still take full advantage of tagging, conversion, and viewport switching by using the new color management node in Batch and manually deciding on your color pipeline. New active color management greatly simplifies and enhances your workflow in Flame 2017 Extension 1.